The thing about scurvy that most people misunderstand is this. It is not a disease that announces itself. It does not arrive with fever or chills or the dramatic symptoms that tell you something is wrong and you should seek treatment. Scurvy arrives quietly, slowly, in symptoms that seem unrelated until they are not. First, your gums get soft. You might notice a little bleeding when you eat, a little tenderness that was not there before, but you think nothing of it because gums bleed sometimes, and winter is hard, and everyone feels a little worn down by February. Then your old wounds stop healing. A cut on your hand that should have closed in a week is still open after a month, red and angry and refusing to knit together. But you think nothing of it because you have been working hard and eating poorly, and the body takes longer to heal when it is tired. Then your joints begin to ache. Your knees hurt when you climb stairs. Your shoulders hurt when you lift. Your whole body feels like it has aged 20 years in 2 months, but you think nothing of it because everyone aches in winter, everyone slows down, everyone feels the cold in their bones. By the time you realize that something is truly wrong, that these symptoms are connected, that they are all pointing toward the same invisible cause, you are already dying. Your body is consuming itself because it lacks the one thing it cannot manufacture on its own. The one nutrient that must come from food because human biology cannot synthesize it. The one vitamin that separates survival from slow dissolution. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid. The substance found in fresh fruits and vegetables that prevents the protein collagen from breaking down, that keeps your gums attached to your teeth and your skin attached to your muscles and your blood vessels intact instead of leaking into your tissues. Without vitamin C, the human body literally falls apart. The collagen that holds everything together loses its integrity, and what was solid becomes soft, and what was connected becomes separated, and eventually you bleed internally in 100 places at once and die of what looks like exhaustion, but is actually structural failure at the cellular level. The sailors of the 18th century knew scurvy well. They called it the plague of the sea, the disease that killed more men than combat and storms and shipwreck combined. They knew that fresh food prevented it, and that salt provisions caused it, and they knew that citrus juice could cure it after a Scottish physician named James Lind proved it in 1747. But the settlers of the American frontier in the 1880s had forgotten what the sailors knew. They had never been to sea. They had never experienced the months-long voyages where fresh food was impossible and scurvy was inevitable. They lived on land where vegetables grew in summer and could theoretically be stored for winter, and they assumed that the dried beans and salted meat and root vegetables in their cellars would sustain them through the cold months. They were wrong. Dried beans have no vitamin C. Salted meat has no vitamin C. Root vegetables like potatoes and carrots have some vitamin C when fresh, but it degrades rapidly in storage, and by February, the potatoes in your cellar have lost most of the nutritional value they had in October. A frontier family eating the standard winter diet of salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, and stored potatoes was getting almost no vitamin C at all, and after 3 or 4 months of this diet, their bodies began to fail in ways they did not understand. The doctors of the era did not help. Medical science in the 1880s had not yet discovered vitamins. The word itself would not be coined until 1912. Physicians knew that certain foods prevented certain diseases, but they did not know why, and many of them dismissed the folk knowledge of what foods to eat as peasant superstition, unworthy of scientific consideration. They prescribed patent medicines and bed rest and purging, treatments that did nothing to address the underlying deficiency, and their patients died while the doctors recorded the cause of death as general debility or exhaustion or failure to thrive. In the Wyoming settlement of Ridgecrest, in the winter of 1886 into 1887, scurvy arrived in January and did not leave until April. 17 people died, nearly a quarter of the settlement's population, their bodies falling apart from the inside because they had eaten nothing with vitamin C since the last fresh vegetables of October. The doctors called it a mysterious wasting illness. The survivors called it the winter death. And Heinrich Baumann, who had spent the previous autumn filling his cellar with ceramic crocks of fermented cabbage, watched his neighbors die while his family remained healthy, and understood exactly what was happening, even if he did not have the scientific vocabulary to explain it. If you want to understand how a German immigrant brought 1,000 years of fermentation knowledge to the Wyoming frontier and saved an entire settlement from the disease that sailors called the Plague of the Sea, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Heinrich had come to Wyoming in the spring of 1882, following rumors of good land and mild winters that turned out to be half true at best. The land was good, rich mountain soil that grew vegetables well in the short summer season. The winters were not mild. They were brutal, long, isolating months when the snow piled 6 feet deep, and the nearest town was 40 miles away over roads that would not be passable until May. He was 40 years old when he arrived, married to Greta for 18 years, with 3 children who ranged from 8 to 16. He had been a farmer in Bavaria, as his father had been, and his grandfather and his great-grandfather stretching back to a time before anyone kept records. The Baumanns had always farmed, and they had always fermented, because in Bavaria you could not survive the winter without fermentation, any more than you could survive without a roof over your head. Fermentation was not a hobby in the German tradition. It was not a culinary choice or a flavor preference. It was survival technology, a method of preserving vegetables through the cold months that maintained their nutritional value when other preservation methods did not. The Germans had been fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut for at least 1,000 years, and they had been fermenting other vegetables, cucumbers into pickles, turnips into sauerrüben, beets into various preparations for just as long. They knew from centuries of experience that fermented vegetables kept people healthy through the winter in ways that dried or salted or root-cellared vegetables did not. They did not know about vitamin C. They did not need to know about vitamin C. They knew that families who ate sauerkraut through the winter did not get the symptoms that families who did not eat sauerkraut got. They knew that sailors who carried barrels of sauerkraut on long voyages stayed healthier than sailors who did not. They knew that the sharp, tangy taste of lacto-fermented vegetables was the taste of survival, even if they could not explain the chemistry behind it. Heinrich had brought this knowledge to Wyoming, the way he had brought his tools and his seeds and his family. It was part of him, as fundamental as breathing, as automatic as planting in spring and harvesting in autumn. The first summer in Ridgecrest, he had grown cabbages, more cabbages than his family could possibly eat fresh, filling an entire quarter acre with the heavy green heads that would become sauerkraut in the autumn. His neighbors had watched with curiosity and then with confusion. "You cannot eat that much cabbage," said Emmett Sloan, who owned the adjacent homestead and considered himself knowledgeable about practical matters. "It will rot before you can finish it. You should plant corn instead. Corn keeps." "It does not rot," Heinrich had replied. "I ferment it." Sloan had not understood the word. Ferment? What is ferment? It is... Heinrich had struggled for the English words. It is like pickling, but not with vinegar, with salt only. The cabbage makes its own preservation. It becomes sauerkraut, sour cabbage. It keeps all winter. It keeps you healthy. Sloan had shaken his head. German food, he said dismissively. We eat American food here. Corn and beans and salt pork. Good solid food that sticks to your ribs. You will learn. Heinrich had not argued. He had simply planted his cabbages, tended them through the summer, harvested them in October, and spent 2 weeks in the autumn slicing and salting and packing the shredded cabbage into ceramic crocks that he had brought from Bavaria specifically for this purpose. He had weighted the crocks with stones, covered them with cloth, and stored them in his root cellar where the temperature stayed cool and constant all winter. By December, the fermentation was complete. The cabbage had transformed into sauerkraut, tangy and crisp, and alive with the lactobacillus bacteria that had converted the natural sugars into lactic acid. The lactic acid preserved the vegetables indefinitely, killed harmful bacteria, and, though Heinrich did not know this, preserved the vitamin C that would have degraded in other storage methods. His family ate sauerkraut every day that winter, a few forkfuls with dinner, a small portion with breakfast, enough to provide the vitamin C that their bodies required without them ever thinking about it in those terms. They stayed healthy. Their gums did not bleed. Their wounds healed normally. Their joints did not ache beyond the ordinary complaints of winter. They survived the first Wyoming winter without any of the symptoms that would kill their neighbors in the years to come. The settlement of Ridgecrest did not notice. They were too busy surviving their own winters, eating their corn and beans and salt pork, developing the subtle early symptoms of vitamin C deficiency that would not become obvious until the deficiency became severe. The first death came in February of 1884. Old Mrs. Patterson, 72 years old, found dead in her bed with her gums bleeding and her skin covered in bruises that had appeared without any injury. The doctor, Cornelius Hadley, diagnosed exhaustion and old age. She was simply worn out, he said. The winter was hard on her. There was nothing to be done. The second death came 3 weeks later. Samuel Garrett, a farmhand of 34, supposedly healthy and strong, found collapsed in the barn with blood seeping from his gums and his legs swollen and purple. Dr. Hadley diagnosed heart failure. A weak constitution, he said. Some men are simply not built for frontier life. There was nothing to be done. The third death, the fourth, the fifth. Each one diagnosed as something other than what it was, because Dr. Hadley did not know what scurvy looked like and would not have believed it if someone had told him. Scurvy was a sailor's disease, a disease of long voyages and ship's biscuit, not a disease of landlocked settlements with cellars full of food. The idea that people could starve for a specific nutrient while their bellies were full of calories was foreign to his understanding of medicine. Heinrich watched the deaths and recognized what he was seeing. In Bavaria, everyone knew the symptoms. In Bavaria, everyone knew the cure. But Heinrich's English was still imperfect, and his attempts to explain fermentation had been met with dismissal, and the doctor, who should have been able to understand, had called his sauerkraut peasant food and recommended that the sick be given beef broth and patent medicines instead. The winter of 1884 to 85 killed 4 people. The winter of 1885 to 86 killed 6 more. Each year, the deaths followed the same pattern. Healthy people in October, tired people in December, sick people in February, dead people in March. Each year, Dr. Hadley diagnosed exhaustion, heart failure, general debility, anything except the obvious truth that the settlement was dying of a vitamin deficiency that could have been cured with cabbage. Heinrich continued making sauerkraut. He expanded his cabbage patch, fermented larger quantities, filled his cellar with crocks that contained enough vitamin C to save the entire settlement if anyone would eat it. He tried to give it away. He brought crocks to his neighbors, explaining as best he could that the sauerkraut would keep them healthy, that it was medicine as well as food, that the Germans had known this for centuries. His neighbors thanked him politely and fed the sauerkraut to their pigs. German food, they said, was not for them. They were Americans. They ate American food. And they died year after year of a disease that Heinrich's sauerkraut could have prevented. The winter of 1886 to 87 was the worst. The cold came early and stayed late. The snow piled higher than anyone had seen, and the settlement was cut off from the outside world from November until April. The food supplies that had seemed adequate in October were running low by February, and the variety that might have provided some vitamin C, the occasional apple or preserved fruit, was completely exhausted. By March, the scurvy was epidemic. 17 people showed obvious symptoms: bleeding gums, loose teeth, wounds that would not heal, joints that ached constantly, skin that bruised at the slightest touch. Dr. Hadley was overwhelmed, his patent medicines useless, his medical knowledge inadequate to address a disease he did not recognize. He diagnosed a mysterious fever, recommended bed rest and liquid diet, and watched his patients deteriorate day by day. Heinrich could bear it no longer. He loaded his wagon with every crock of sauerkraut in his cellar, drove to the center of the settlement, despite the snow that made travel nearly impossible, and began going door to door with his fermented cabbage and his broken English and his desperate certainty that he knew what was killing his neighbors. The Garfields were the first family he visited. Thomas Garfield, 41 years old, was bedridden with classic scurvy symptoms. His wife and 3 children were showing early signs. Dr. Hadley had prescribed bed rest and beef tea, and was expecting the entire family to die within the month. "This is medicine," Heinrich said, holding out a bowl of sauerkraut. "Not food. Medicine. You eat this every day, you live. You do not eat this, you die. I have seen this before. In the old country. It is the winter sickness. The sauerkraut stops it." Mrs. Garfield looked at the bowl of shredded cabbage with obvious skepticism. "Dr. Hadley says we need rest and broth. He says there is nothing else to be done." "Dr. Hadley is wrong," Heinrich said, flatly. "Dr. Hadley does not know this sickness. I know this sickness. My family eats sauerkraut every day. My family is not sick. Your family does not eat sauerkraut. Your family is dying. This is not coincidence. This is cause and effect. Eat the sauerkraut or die. It is simple." The bluntness shocked her into compliance. She fed her husband a few spoonfuls of sauerkraut, then ate some herself, then fed it to her children. The taste was unfamiliar, sour, and tangy in a way that American palates did not expect, but it was not unpleasant, and desperation makes unfamiliar things acceptable. Heinrich left a full crock and instructions to eat some every day, then moved to the next house. He visited every sick family in the settlement over 2 days, distributing sauerkraut, explaining the connection between fermented vegetables and winter health, begging people to trust the knowledge that his family had accumulated over 1,000 years of surviving winters that would have killed anyone who did not know the secrets. Some listened, some did not. The ones who listened began to recover within days. The transformation was dramatic and unmistakable. Thomas Garfield, who had been unable to stand on March 1st, was walking by March 10th. His gums stopped bleeding. His bruises began to fade. His strength returned with a speed that Dr. Hadley called miraculous and Heinrich called predictable. The ones who did not listen continued to deteriorate. 3 more people died in the second week of March, their families having refused the sauerkraut because Dr. Hadley told them it was peasant superstition and could not possibly affect a serious illness. They died of stubbornness as much as scurvy, killed by the certainty that modern medicine knew better than German tradition. But the recoveries were too dramatic to ignore. By mid-March, the pattern was obvious. The families eating sauerkraut were getting better. The families refusing sauerkraut were getting worse. The evidence was accumulating in bodies that healed and bodies that did not, in gums that firmed and gums that bled, in people who walked and people who lay in their beds, waiting to die. Dr. Hadley resisted the evidence for as long as he could. He called it coincidence, then placebo effect, then unexplained spontaneous recovery. He could not accept that fermented cabbage was curing a disease that his medical training had not taught him to recognize, that peasant food was succeeding where patent medicine had failed, that his entire understanding of nutrition and illness was incomplete. But the evidence did not care about his resistance. The sauerkraut kept curing, the medicine kept failing, and eventually, even Dr. Hadley had to acknowledge that something was happening that his theories could not explain. The reckoning came in April, after the snow had begun to melt, and the survivors could travel to the settlement center for the meeting that everyone knew was necessary. 17 people had died over the winter, the worst mortality the settlement had ever experienced. The survivors wanted answers. They wanted to understand what had killed their neighbors and why some families had been spared. Heinrich spoke first, at the request of the families he had saved. He explained fermentation in the clearest terms his English could manage. He described the symptoms of the winter sickness and how they matched what the settlement had experienced. He described how German families had known for centuries that sauerkraut and other fermented vegetables kept people healthy through winter, even if they did not understand the science behind it. He described how his own family had eaten sauerkraut every day and had never shown any symptoms while their neighbors sickened and died. The sailors knew this, he said. The German sailors, the Dutch sailors, they carried barrels of sauerkraut on long voyages. They did not get the scurvy that English sailors got. This was known 200 years ago. Captain Cook carried sauerkraut around the world and lost almost no men to scurvy. It is not new knowledge. It is old knowledge that Americans have forgotten. He looked at Dr. Hadley, who sat in the front row with his medical bag on his lap and his certainty in ruins around him. The doctor said it was superstition. The doctor said fermented cabbage could not cure a serious illness. The doctor was wrong. 17 people are dead because the doctor did not know what German farmers have known for 1,000 years. I do not blame the doctor. He cannot know what he was not taught. But I blame the pride that would not listen when I tried to explain. I blame the certainty that American ways are always better than old country ways. I blame the dismissal of peasant food by people who were dying for want of it. Dr. Hadley rose to respond. His face was pale, his hands trembling, his voice unsteady. I am a physician, he said. I trained at the finest medical college in Philadelphia. I have read the latest medical journals. I have administered the most modern treatments. And I watched 17 people die of a disease I did not recognize while a German farmer cured it with cabbage. He stopped, unable to continue for a moment. I was taught that folk remedies were superstition. I was taught that modern medicine had surpassed the crude knowledge of previous centuries. I was taught that scientific understanding was superior to traditional practice. I believed what I was taught. I dismissed Mr. Bauman's sauerkraut because it did not fit what I believed, not because I had evidence that it did not work. His voice broke. I told dying people that fermented cabbage could not help them. I told them to trust my medicines instead. My medicines did nothing. The cabbage saved lives. I do not know how to apologize for what I did. I do not know how to make amends to the families who lost people because I was too proud to listen to a farmer who knew more about winter sickness than I did. I only know that I will never again dismiss a remedy simply because it does not fit my theories. I will observe what works. I will learn from people who have knowledge I do not have. I will be a student again, even at my age, because being a student is better than being a murderer of patients who trusted me. The gathering was silent. The confession was more complete than anyone had expected, more damning than any accusation could have been. Dr. Hadley had convicted himself with his own words, had acknowledged that his pride had contributed to 17 deaths, had admitted that a German immigrant's cabbage was better medicine than anything in his black bag. Heinrich spoke again, his voice gentler than before. I do not want the doctor to suffer. I want him to learn. The sickness, the winter sickness, it comes from eating only preserved food for many months. The body needs something that is in fresh food, something that dried beans and salt pork do not have. I do not know what this something is. I only know that sauerkraut has it when other preserved foods do not. The fermentation preserves what storage destroys. This is what my family has always known. This is what I tried to explain and could not make people understand until they saw it with their own eyes. He looked around the room at the survivors, at the people who had watched their neighbors die and had nearly died themselves. Next autumn, everyone ferments. I will teach you. The cabbage, the turnips, the beets, everything can be fermented. You make crocks full, and you eat some every day all winter. No one dies of the winter sickness again. This is simple. This is easy. You only have to do what Germans have always done. The fermentation workshops began that summer. Heinrich taught every family in Ridgecrest how to make sauerkraut, how to shred cabbage and mix it with salt and pack it into crocks and weight it down and let the lactobacillus bacteria do their work. He taught them how to ferment other vegetables, how to make pickled cucumbers and fermented beets, and any other preparation they wanted to try. He taught them how to recognize good fermentation and bad fermentation, how to know when the process was complete, how to store the finished product so it would last all winter. By October, every cellar in Ridgecrest contained crocks of fermenting vegetables. By December, the fermentation was complete. By February, when the scurvy would have been killing people in previous years, the settlement was healthy. No bleeding gums, no unhealed wounds, no aching joints beyond the ordinary complaints of winter, no mysterious wasting illness, no deaths. The sauerkraut had worked exactly as Heinrich had promised. The winter of 1887 to 88 passed without a single case of what the settlers still called the winter sickness. The winter of 1888 to 89 was the same. By the 1890s, fermented vegetables were as common in Ridgecrest as salt pork and cornmeal. And the winter sickness was a memory that old-timers told to children who could not imagine a time when people died every spring for reasons no one understood. Dr. Hadley became one of the most vocal advocates for fermented vegetables in the Wyoming Territory. He wrote letters to medical journals describing what he had witnessed, urging other physicians to consider that folk remedies might contain wisdom that scientific medicine had not yet explained. Most of his letters were rejected or ignored. The medical establishment was not ready to learn from German farmers. But Hadley kept writing, kept advocating, kept telling anyone who would listen that 17 people had died in his settlement because he had dismissed a remedy that worked. The phrase German medicine entered the vocabulary of the Wyoming frontier and spread across the mountain territories. It meant trusting traditional knowledge that science had not yet validated, accepting that peasant practices sometimes knew things that educated practitioners did not, believing in what worked even when you could not explain why it worked. It was spoken with respect, as if the speaker understood something about humility that could only be learned through watching people die of curable diseases. Heinrich Baumann lived on his Wyoming homestead for another 31 years, passing in the spring of 1918 at the age of 76. Greta followed him 2 years later, having fermented cabbage every autumn for nearly 5 decades in 2 countries. Their children inherited the land and the knowledge, and their grandchildren after them, and the family still makes sauerkraut in the same ceramic crocks that Heinrich brought from Bavaria in 1882. The crocks are museum pieces now, displayed in the family's farmhouse kitchen as a reminder of what they preserved and why. They are not antiques. They are still used every autumn, still filled with shredded cabbage and salt, still weighted with stones and covered with cloth, and left to ferment in the cellar where the temperature stays cool and constant. The sauerkraut they produce tastes the same as it did in 1886, the same as it did in 1786, the same as it has tasted for 1,000 years of German winters. Above the cellar door, carved in letters that Heinrich added in the years after the Great Dying, is an inscription in both German and English. Sauerkraut ist Medizin. Sauerkraut is medicine. The settlers who had fed his sauerkraut to their pigs, who had called it peasant food, who had watched their families bleed and weaken and die while refusing to eat what could have saved them, they understood exactly what those words meant. And if you learned something from this story about fermentation and vitamin C, and the knowledge that kept one family healthy while their neighbors died, subscribe to this channel, because we have more stories about the forgotten science that kept people alive before modern nutrition made everyone forget how to eat for survival. The lactobacillus bacteria are still there, in the wild cultures that cling to cabbage leaves, ready to transform fresh vegetables into preserved medicine. The process still works exactly as it did when Heinrich was young. The only question is whether we are humble enough to use it